He walked onto the plane with quiet confidence, dressed neatly, carrying only his ticket and dignity. But the moment he stepped into first class, all eyes turned, not with respect but with disbelief. The air grew heavier as whispers spread, and then the pilot himself decided to make a scene. What followed wasn't just about one man taking his seat. It became a test of humanity, prejudice, and justice. How could something as simple as sitting down spark a confrontation that would leave the entire cabin in shock? For Marcus, this trip was supposed to be nothing more than routine. He was a successful entrepreneur, flying home after closing a deal that had taken months of effort. In many ways, he was the kind of man who inspired others, hard-working, soft-spoken, and proud of how far he had come. He'd grown up in a modest neighborhood, where dreams of traveling in first class felt impossibly distant. Yet here he was, finally living the life he once only imagined. As he walked through the airport that morning, Marcus carried himself with quiet assurance. He had done everything right, booked his ticket, passed security, and now prepared to enjoy a few hours of peace before seeing his family again. To him, it was just another flight. Nothing about this day seemed unusual. But the truth was, the unusual part hadn't started yet. Hidden beneath the surface of this ordinary journey was a confrontation waiting to unfold, one that would test not just Marcus's patience, but the values of everyone who witnessed it. Because sometimes, the ugliest side of prejudice doesn't come when you expect it. It comes when you think you're safe. And Marcus, stepping toward the first-class cabin, had no idea that within minutes, his dignity would be challenged in a way no one could ignore. Marcus handed his ticket to the flight attendant with a polite smile, expecting nothing more than a nod of confirmation. Instead, she hesitated, her eyes flicking from the ticket to Marcus and then back again. A pause too long, a hesitation too obvious. Finally, she forced a smile and gestured him forward. "This way, sir." Marcus brushed it off. He'd dealt with subtle looks and quiet doubts before, but the moment he stepped into the first-class cabin, the atmosphere shifted. Passengers glanced up from their magazines and phones, eyes narrowing as if he'd walked into a room where he didn't belong. Whispers spread, short, sharp, and cutting. Though no one dared to speak loud enough to be heard clearly, he tried to ignore it, focusing instead on finding his seat. He placed his bag carefully in the overhead compartment, adjusted his jacket, and sat down with quiet dignity. But before he could even settle, a shadow loomed over him. It was the pilot. The man's posture radiated authority, but his tone carried something colder, something designed to cut. "Sir, I think you're in the wrong section," he said, his voice firm enough that nearby passengers instantly perked up. Marcus felt every eye lock onto him. His throat tightened, but calmly. He reached into his jacket and handed over his boarding pass. "This is my seat," he replied evenly. The pilot studied the ticket, his jaw tightening. Instead of stepping away, he doubled down. "These seats are reserved." "Perhaps you meant economy." The words hung in the air like poison, deliberate and humiliating. Gasps rippled through the cabin. Some passengers smirked. Others pretended not to notice. But all of them felt the tension simmering just inches away. Marcus sat frozen for a moment, 1,000 thoughts racing. Should he argue? Should he stand? Should he let it go? But letting it go would mean surrendering to the very prejudice he had fought his entire life to rise above. "I believe this is my rightful seat," Marcus said, his voice steady but heavy with unspoken pain. The silence that followed was suffocating. The flight attendant shifted uncomfortably. The passengers watched, waiting, some with quiet approval of the pilot, others with unease. The confrontation had crossed from subtle to unmistakable, and still the pilot refused to back down. "Sir," he said, sharper this time, "if you don't comply, we may have to remove you from this aircraft." Marcus's heart pounded. The threat was clear: sit down and be silent, or risk public humiliation and removal. Around him, strangers waited to see if he would break, if he would fold under the weight of prejudice disguised as authority. But Marcus wasn't about to bow his head. And in the next few seconds, the way he responded would decide whether this flight continued as planned, or whether the truth about injustice would finally be forced into the open. The cabin fell into a suffocating silence. As the pilot's words echoed, "We may have to remove you," Marcus's chest tightened. It wasn't just about a seat anymore. It was about dignity, identity, and the weight of generations who had faced the same silent judgment. Every eye was on him. Some passengers waited for him to fold. Others prayed silently that he wouldn't. Marcus's palms pressed against his knees, trembling, not from fear but from the rage building inside. He thought of his father, who once told him, "You don't have to shout to stand tall. Just don't let them take your place." Summoning every ounce of courage, Marcus rose, not to leave but to be heard. His voice carried through the cabin, calm yet unshakable. "I bought this ticket. I earned this seat. And I will not be moved simply because someone believes I don't belong here." Gasps rippled through the rows. The audacity of speaking back to authority in that moment felt dangerous, almost forbidden, but Marcus's words pierced the air like lightning. The flight attendant stepped forward, caught between duty and conscience. Her eyes flicked to the pilot, then back to Marcus. Her voice wavered, but she spoke. "Captain, his ticket is valid. He's exactly where he's supposed to be." The pilot froze, his face a mask of disbelief and anger. For the first time, his authority was being questioned, not by Marcus, but by one of his own crew. The tension shattered into chaos. Some passengers clapped quietly, others whispered, some glared with disdain. The moment had shifted. The pilot's attempt to humiliate had backfired, and now he stood exposed before everyone. Marcus sat back down, his heart pounding, his hands shaking but his head held high. He hadn't just defended his seat, he had defended his very right to exist without apology. And in that charged silence, everyone on board realized this was no longer about one man in first class. It was about what kind of world they were willing to accept. The rest of the flight passed in uneasy silence. The pilot retreated, his authority cracked, while Marcus remained seated in quiet strength. But even as the cabin settled, the weight of what happened lingered in the air. For Marcus, it wasn't victory, it was survival. Survival in a world where dignity could still be questioned, even when every rule was followed. Every ticket was valid, every right was earned. When he finally walked off that plane, Marcus carried more than his luggage. He carried the reminder that progress was fragile, that prejudice still waited in the shadows, ready to strike at the most ordinary moments. And he carried the hope that his refusal to back down might have planted a seed in the minds of those who witnessed it. A seed that said silence is not strength, and injustice thrives only when we look away. This wasn't just one man's fight for a seat in first class. It was the story of countless others whose worth is challenged not by their actions, but by the color of their skin. It was a mirror held up to society, reflecting an ugly truth many would rather ignore. And now the question rests with us. How many more Marcuses will be forced to defend their place before change truly takes root? Because in the end, the real seat that matters isn't on an airplane. It's in the world we build together. Will we allow prejudice to decide who belongs, or will we finally stand for a humanity that refuses to divide?